Hi there, I'm Danny Flexen. Welcome to this week's edition of SecondsOut ReFLEXions. Every Monday we're here at 4:30 PM to look at some of the recent events in boxing. And this week I wanted to talk about something that came up on social media. A lot of my stuff seems to be influenced by those platforms at the moment, with boxing or live boxing being in short supply, although that is starting to change. The writer Steve Kim responded to a lot of comparisons between boxing and MMA, specifically UFC at the weekend, in terms of how quickly fighters will be ready to compete, and also how willing they are to go into fights at short notice. Now, this was sparked by the MMA fighter Jorge Masvidal going in against Kamaru Usman at short notice, 6 days notice I believe it was, for a clash this weekend on Fight Island, as it's now known, for the welterweight title. And just the fact that there's a few nuances to this first, and one of them is that Masvidal against Usman was originally on the cards for this show quite a while ago. So there would have been some level not just of training that Masvidal was taking part in, but also preparing for that specific opponent. And then around a month ago, negotiations between UFC and Masvidal broke down, and the fight was offered to Gilbert Burns, who eventually dropped out, leaving the way clear for Masvidal to renegotiate and come back in at short notice. So he's not going in against a completely unknown quantity at 6 days notice. That does have to be noted, although he should still be praised for grasping this opportunity when he thought it had gone. But it's led to people comparing the two sports, and that a lot of fighters are keen to protect their records or not want to go in against a dangerous opponent at short notice if they feel the odds are stacked against them. And something that Steve Kim pointed out was that in the older days of boxing, not only did fighters compete a lot more often, but they were often willing to get into a fight at 4 to 6 weeks notice. So having an abbreviated training camp, largely because, certainly in Kim's view, that they were living the life all year round. So they saw boxing as a profession, there's their job, they were living the life constantly, so being on top of their weight and their diet, and doing some level of kind of ticking over training on a regular basis. And it appears times have to an extent changed. There's a lot of fighters out there now who will train hard during a training camp for 8, 10, 12 weeks, have the fight, so they'll be geared towards a specific date, have that fight on that date, take some time off and literally do nothing, maybe tick over some guys don't, and then go back in the gym and start the process all over again, which is one of the reasons why fighters in 2020, compared to say 50 years ago, maybe only fight 2 to 3 times a year. Whereas guys in the past, some of the greats that we celebrate now, the likes of Sugar Ray Robinson and so on, fought double figures times per year on occasion, or maybe not on occasion, summarily. So it's an interesting one, because I understand the point that fighters these days maybe don't live a 24/7, 365 lifestyle. But the flip side of that is that there's a lot more different elements of training and nutrition and stuff like that that have become popular in the modern era. So fighters now will do their boxing training, sparring, strength and conditioning. Some will do other things like Pilates, yoga for flexibility and stuff like that. The point is, in the old days, a lot of these guys that were ready to fight at the drop of a hat used their sparring basically for fitness as much as anything else, as well as sharpening up. You know, so they'd go in, they'd spar, they'd do their basic training, maybe groundwork, bit of running obviously on the roads, and then they'd be ready to fight every few weeks. Now the trainings are a lot more intense, because fighters are geared up to a peak 2 or 3 times a year, and to be at their absolute best, both physically, tactically, all of the elements. So it is slightly different in that sense, and to expect a fighter that's training 2-3 times a day during a fight camp to then fight at the drop of a hat against an opponent they may not have prepared for might be too big an ask. And it's something that's really been brought to the fore since the lockdown restrictions began to be eased. Because now fighters, the ones who've stayed in the gym and who've kept sharp and who've had facilities at home perhaps, whereas some don't have that luxury, they're the ones who are now ready to compete at short notice, even in quite difficult or 50-50 fights. That's also perhaps the reason why we've seen a few upsets, certainly on the top rank cards so far, because the time off has been a real leveller, and fighters have had to go in with abbreviated camps, whereas normally when you see kind of a 60-40 or 70-30 fight, you'll often find that the house fighter is the one who's had 8 weeks to prepare, sometimes knows about the opponent first as well, who he's going to be fighting, whereas there's still negotiations going on and the opponent doesn't know for certain what the date's going to be yet. So he'll have an 8-week serious training camp. The opponent, either because of those reasons or perhaps they've got a job, they're not a full-time pro, they've not been able to train hard for 8 weeks. They've had to cram it all into a 4-week training camp. And that gives a lopsided advantage to the house fighter in a lot of cases. But because of what's happened with COVID and because people haven't been able to get in the gym, even top fighters, as we talked about recently with the case of Amanda Serrano, have found it difficult to get into the gym and train as they normally would. It means that upsets and 50-50 fights, competitive fights, are more likely, whereas they wouldn't have been before on paper, because both guys have had to come in with the same amount of training, or roughly similar amount of training, and a similar amount of notice. So that makes it more interesting. But going back to the original point, in recent vlogs I've defended Serrano and her right to only fight a hugely important contest against Katie Taylor when she feels she's at her very best and she's trained as hard as she possibly can. That's obviously not the case at the moment, which is why the fight's not happening. But then you do look at someone in UFC like Masvidal, who's come in at 6 days' notice, and regardless of whether he was previously preparing for Usman, he didn't know until yesterday or whenever it was, or the day before, that it was definitely going to take place this weekend. So he's backed himself basically, and it is a gamble. But I suppose the kind of aspect of that is that if he does fall short, he will always have that to fall back on. People always look at it and say, well, he did come in at 6 days' notice. It was great of him that he saved the show in that way. He's made his money, and if they both had a full camp, perhaps the result would be different. Now, I'm not saying he's going in with that mindset, because I'm sure he believes he'll win the fight. But that is an aspect of it, that if you've got a ready-made excuse, you're almost in a no-lose situation. I think in boxing it's a little bit different. I don't know how forgiving not just fans, but writers and TV networks and promoters would be of someone who went in, got beaten up, lost a lot of their market value, and then said, yeah, but you know, I did take it on a few weeks' notice. I don't think we're as forgiving. UFC is not just about protecting, it's not as much as boxing about protecting an unbeaten record and, you know, having a glossy build-up against contenders who are never going to beat you and building up these stars before they're ready to get into a marquee fight. UFC is not really like that. It sells not just on specific figures, perhaps Conor McGregor, John Jones aside, but more on the whole concept and the whole brand of UFC sells itself, because it is a uniform brand that dominates MMA. We don't have that in boxing as much as the likes of PBC have tried. So we have to rely on creating marquee stars, superstars, if you like, the likes of Canelo and Anthony Joshua. And I don't think either of those guys would be about to take on a dangerous opponent at 6 weeks' notice or 4 weeks' notice, because they are different things. It would do almost irreparable harm to their profile and their star power and their earning potential, most importantly, if they were to lose on that basis. Whereas Masvidal, after the year he's had, the way he's been built up, and the fact that he's still tied to UFC, and they will look after him if he does lose as well, that's an important point, he won't have to worry so much about that. He'll expect to win the fight, but if he doesn't, he will still be built back up into a huge attraction, because he's already a big attraction. He won't be harmed by a defeat in the same way boxers are harmed by the defeat. So I think we're kind of comparing apples and oranges, although I do feel boxers should be on the job all year round. It's easy for me to say with a beer gut and, you know, unable to control any cravings, do you know what I mean? But for boxers, if it's your job, I think it is important to kind of at least tick over and keep to a relatively healthy dietary regimen on a regular basis. But it'd be good to know what other people out there think, and whether boxers should be expected to go in at short notice to a dangerous fight if the upside is sufficiently attractive. You know, if you do manage to pull off the win, the rewards are really, really great. So let me know what you think about that and how it compares to the UFC example that a lot of people highlighted over the weekend. I'll be back on Thursday for FlexPectations, 4:30 PM, and next week, Monday, for the next ReFLEXions, same time. Really appreciate it, as always, and I'll see you all soon. Cheers.